This is Eric Weingartner with Weingartner Racing, and today's video is going to be about bigger valves and coefficient of discharge. And I'll get to what I mean about both those here in a second. I'll start off by saying, because several people have asked, I did run the S10, and hopefully that'll be in a later video. In case you're wondering about the suspense, it did do a little bit better, but not as good as you want, but not as bad as it could be, and we'll get to that. But that's a later video. I want to talk about that. But before I also do any explanation, I might as well give you this little disclaimer, I guess. I am not going to pretend to be a god of anything, that I know everything that there is to know, and that whatever I say is 100% the gospel. I'm just giving you information what I've learned through the years. You're more than welcome to go and research what other people have said and done to see how it might be different from what I've said and done. But I'm telling you this just because I want you guys to understand. I'm just giving you information, but it's up to you to do your own research. You can take this with a grain of salt. This is just what I've learned throughout the years. So anyway, let's begin. There are two real things we need to talk about first. One of them, because I talked about it, is coefficient of discharge. That term refers to, let's do my best. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, this head is a Brodix 18C head I've ported. It means it's 18-degree valve job, and it is for a small block Chevy. This one's got a 220 valve on the intake, had 218 initially, and it flows 392. It flowed 352 stock. So picked up quite a bit. I'll probably do a video on this later, but I'm just using this head more of an example. Okay, so let's talk about what coefficient of discharge is. Coefficient of discharge says there's an area here that goes around the valve, and typically that's at the throat. So there's an area that goes around here, and the amount of area and how much air goes through that area is called the coefficient of discharge. So in this case, trying to get my camera to pull back up, there we go. In this case, what I'm trying to say is coefficient of discharge is really just the amount of air that goes through a certain area. And usually when they talk about it, they mean about the valve itself. So it's a really common term, and it's used a lot for head porters. And I mentioned before that I heard Brian Tooley talking about it, and that he'd always said that any head that gained the coefficient of discharge, in other words, it flowed more air for the size that it was, it always went faster. And I agree with him to a certain extent, but there are things where I found that not entirely to be truthful. And then the other part of the video has to do with bigger valves. Because bigger valves, I've heard this repeatedly, has to do with every time sometimes you put a bigger valve in the head and it goes slower. Doesn't it make the low speed velocity worse? Doesn't it make things slower down low? I don't want to be a dog down low if I put the bigger valves. That's a myth. But just like all myths, there's a little bit of truth mixed into that. And I'll try to explain the reason why that is. So let's go through some terms. So now that you know what coefficient of discharge is, I hope. Let's go through some terms so that you'll understand. First off, we need to talk about what the throat is, because that's actually the most important part. So I've done a crappy drawing. This would be your valve, obviously. And inside the port, so it comes down, that's where the valve job is sitting. This right here, usually right underneath the valve job, is your throat. If in a perfect world, the smallest part of the port would be the throat. That's actually right below the valve. Of course, in a small block Chevy head, usually it's at the pushrod pinch. Until things get bigger, then it actually shifts down here. But in a perfect head, the smallest area should be at the throat, which is there. Now, what a lot of people say about using a bigger valve is it makes things more of a doggy. It's not responsive. And I told you that some of the myths are based with a little bit of fact. And let me explain. The two times I've heard about the most is usually whenever people talk about the Vortex cylinder head for a small block Chevy. Those heads have a 194 intake valve. And the most common thing I hear is, well, I put a 202 valve in it and it went slower. And also the same thing could be said for LS heads, where someone will put a bigger valve in a stock one and it also goes slower. So let's talk about why that could be and how that happens. Well, if you just simply, this initially had a 218 valve, but let's say I didn't do anything else besides I just cut the valve job larger and made it so that a 202 intake valve fits in. Or sorry, not 202, 220 intake valve fits in. It's clearly larger. It's actually going to be slower, and let me talk about why. Because the valve, that's the head, so we'll go across here, is not the smallest part of the port. The throat is. So if I simply just cut out the valve job, all I'm really doing is increasing the spot where the valve actually sits, not the smaller part where the throat is. So yeah, you made the valve bigger, but that didn't really do anything because the throat's still the same size. So if you just cut for a larger valve job but do no extra port work to address the throat, well, guess what? It's probably going to be slower, because what happens is now the larger valve is going to block the flow coming out because you still have the same size throat. And it's also usually going to leave a ledge because you didn't do any port work on the sides. So it's worse for the air coming out hitting in the chamber. And then the other downside is the valve weighs more. So you're more likely to go in a valve float. You can also say, well, no, I size the throats. Well, I want to show you this little bit of math. Okay. I'm sorry for the yellow paper if it has a little bit of glare. These are what I use for note cards. Let's say you had a head and it has a two-way intake valve. And let's say you made the throat 91% of the valves. In other words, I take 91% times 2.08. That gives me a diameter of 1.8928. In case you wonder how to figure out the area of the throat, it's simply pi r squared because it should be a circle. It's not quite, but we'll pretend it is. Anyway, you take that diameter, you divide it by 2, and that will get your radius, times 3.14. And in this case, on the 208 valve, the cross-sectional area at the throat is 2.81. Now someone's going to say, wait a minute, you didn't subtract the valve diameter. You're right, I didn't. And the reason why I didn't is because I'm going to pretend that both these have the same valve stem diameter. And just to keep the math simple, I'm going to pretend that they're the same, and we're not going to subtract it just to make sure that the math stays the same. Okay, so that's the area of the 2.08 valve. Now let's say you put a 210 intake valve and you make the throat 90%. That gives me a diameter of 1.890 or 1.89, which, look, that diameter is smaller. So guess what? The CSA is smaller. So you've got a bigger valve than the 210, but the throat's actually smaller because you didn't enlarge it. And the area is less. So you see why it can have the problem. So there's where the people with the myth about the bigger valve that went slower come into play. Now, I wouldn't say it's a myth, but that's the only where I could say it's correct. Now, in my experience, and I mean years of experience, I have not seen this to be the case. Every single time I've made the intake valve bigger, the head flows more, typically, not always a ton, but it almost, and I shouldn't say almost, it always goes faster. Makes more horsepower and goes faster. And you're like, well, how can that be? Didn't you just say no? Because what I did instead is, if I look at this math, I don't leave the throat at 90%. I make it the same as what it would have been at 208 valve. And guess what? The area is bigger, it flows more air. Having a bigger valve also makes the engine act like you've got a bigger cam. You're like, what do you mean? You didn't make the cam size change. It has nothing to do with it. Well, let me explain. There's something called curtain area. And that is, I'm going to shove my valve through here. Dropping it down. Okay. Of course, no one's going to have this much lift. Well, someone might. The curtain area is from here on the seat all the way up to where the valve is and all the way around it. This is called curtain area. Now, let's pretend you only had a 550 lift. So something much, much shorter. Okay? Say something like that. The curtain area is all the way around it. Well, if you have, say, a 208 valve, the area that's there around the throat itself, since the throat's there, and that whole area from extending from the valve up, at 550 lift is a certain amount. Well, if I just do nothing else, don't make the cam lift bigger, but I make the valve larger, that whole area that it's exposed is larger. So it makes the camshaft feel like it's more aggressive than it is, because what happens is it's seeing more area quicker. So, and throughout the entire lift curve. So at 100, 200, 300 thousandths of lift, all the way up, it's got more area there. So it makes the cam act like it's quicker than what it is, like it's a faster or more aggressive lobe. And usually with that, you get more air in the cylinder quicker and so on and so forth. Now someone's gonna say, whoa, wait a minute, doesn't the velocity slow down because you made it bigger? Well, typically when you port, if you could port right, the coefficient of discharge, the amount of air that's coming through for that size is usually about the same, okay? Usually, and I'll get to why, and that's why Brian Tooley, when he was talking about in that podcast, about when the coefficient of discharge increases, it always goes faster he's ever seen. And I'll tell you this, I'm gonna play the devil's advocate and tell you the time where I've seen it not be entirely the case. So typically make the valve bigger, valve job, everything else, the port flows more, so you have the same coefficient of discharge, it's a win-win. In matters of fact, because the camshaft seems like it's getting more aggressive there, you can actually sometimes decrease the duration, which then builds up more cylinder pressure, you make more power. Now there's some catches to this as well, but I just want to kind of give you that idea. Now, I was a thorough believer in it because I attended Darren Morgan's porting classes years ago, and he talked about this religiously too, about the coefficient of discharge being so important, and it is. And so when I started, and this is for those head porters, you want to be good at head porter, here's what you need to see, what you need to do, flat out. Get a book. Every time you do any work on a cylinder head, you write it down. So I'm going to show you. This is just from 2011, so it's got a bunch of junk in here. But I wanted to show you this. I'm going to move stuff out of the way. I actually used to, if you look at this, I wrote down, this is coefficient of discharge heads, the average coefficient of discharge. And I had them by categories. So between 90 and 99%, you know, and less and so on. So these ones right here end up being the highest ones that I had as of 2011. Now, of course, these have long changed. But if you look at what I've got here as far as them, let me find my pointer again. Got hidden underneath the book, sorry. A little delay. If we look, so the highest one I had, this was my RHS big block Chevy 320 head. This one had a really good 92.02. It wasn't the highest. That one was, this was a dash 12 head, which is a 15-degree head by a small block Chevy. But here's what Brian Tooley's are. This is a TA ported, which is definitely Brian Tooley, 91.2. So he had one in there. Another one's a Trick Flow small block Ford head. It was also 90.2. So he had several that were there. But this one's, in case you remember those headhunters I told you I was going to use for my small block Chevy, the next engine for the S10. Darren Morgan, he brought them for me to flow, and that coefficient discharge was pretty high up there too. These ones are all really good heads, so it kind of shows you. I used to do this religiously on every head I did, and you can tell how many there are. This is just 2011. There's, I mean, I've got another book right here of 2012. I ended up stopped doing it, and the reason why is, one, it took up too much time, and two, because I found a flaw. Here's the flaw with it. This math sounds great and everything, and you're like, okay, it's very important, it's helpful, useful, reveals a lot of stuff. It tells me how efficient it is at the valve job, and at the throat, and it tells me a lot. But I started to see situations where these were prime heads, but I'd see heads that were end up in this range, in the 89 or less percent, definitely less coefficient of discharge than these high-end ones that made more power. And the question that you have to ask is, when this happens, is why? How can this be? It shouldn't be that way. Well, here's why. The engine itself, it doesn't care about what you believe. It doesn't care about your math. Not that the engines don't follow the math. It wants what it wants when it wants it. So what I started to see, and this is why I say the coefficient of discharge isn't always all that. What I started to see was, there were times where it made more power with less coefficient discharge, and the reason for that was because the engine wanted a certain amount of air. It didn't care that the coefficient discharge or the amount of flow coming through that size was great. It just simply wanted more air. So making the valve larger, it gained a few CFM, but compared to the smaller valve, the coefficient discharge was less. But it flowed more through the entire lift curve, but not the same percent as the smaller throat valve situation. So yeah, it flowed more because the engine wanted more air. Even though it didn't have the same velocity leaving, it needed more air, so it made more power because that's what it wanted. And I started seeing that more and more on certain engines. So just to give you an idea, when I'm just trying to help you out there, just to kind of summarize, coefficient discharge is very important. You can usually tell when you have two heads of the same size of valve, the one that flows more on the same bench, because you can't compare benches to benches. Good luck. I've got two different benches and you can't. They'll lead you in the wrong way. But if you got two heads, same size valve, and one flows more than the other, and the velocity throughout the port, you don't have like high areas and stuff, usually they see the coefficient of discharge will tell you, hey, it's better. But usually, engines want a certain amount of air to make more power. So in other words, I could shrink the valve down like that. You want to increase your coefficient of discharge? It's really simple. Make the valve smaller, because now you've got less area and the port really becomes more efficient because there's so much more there. So it makes your coefficient of discharge usually jump up. But the engine doesn't want that. It wants the more area for the curtain. It does.
I didn't get that.
Sorry, Siri's acting stupid. It wants more area, curtain area, and it wants more air. So it doesn't, I mean, it likes your math, but it wants what it wants, and it makes more power. So there's my devil's advocate to the coefficient discharge. There are times when it just doesn't apply. So hopefully that helps. Now, something else to think about, because this happens a bunch. A lot of people, which I could do a whole video, and I probably should just do a separate one, and maybe I will, about throats. All those that I showed you on this page were average coefficient of discharges. In other words, I added up all the flow throughout the curve and then divided it by, averaged all the flow throughout the curve, all the way to 1 inch of width, 1/10 to 1 inch, then divided it by the area and got what I got. Of course, used that then and got my average coefficient of discharge. Some people just simply do it off the peak flow, but here's where that gets kind of catchy. You can actually make the peak flow better, but kill low lift flow. And I'm not talking 1, 2, I really don't care. I'm talking about 4, 6, and up by making the throat too large. So then if you're just doing by peak coefficient of discharge, well, because the throat's so big, it's moving a lot of air, but the low lift flow is terrible. And it doesn't make more power, even though the peak coefficient of discharge is better. So there's some of that. Now I'm like, well, that's your opinion. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, I want to show you this. I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but we'll see. This is Popular Hot Rodding from 2008, February. This is after the first Engine Masters I competed in. And I want to show you this because it's the prime example. Anyway, this was the Engine Master competition, in case you're wondering. Popular Hot Rodding doesn't exist anymore, but you can find this magazine. For those that are younger, this is a magazine. This is what we used before the internet. Anyway, this is the prime example. The rules for this were it was horsepower per cubic inch. You had to run a flat tappet camshaft. I think it was 10.5 to 1, and they average your horsepower and torque from 2,500 to 6,500. And you had to be a stock cam core size, stock lifter diameter. So for a Chevy, you'd feel like it would suck because you have an 842 diameter lifter, standard cam core, compared to a Ford, which got a much bigger, like an 875 flat tappet, so everything should be more aggressive. So you would figure out Ford to just kill it. Check this out. And this will go to the coefficient discharge. This is the guy that won, which if you don't know who he is, he's amazing. This is Tony Bischoff, and this is the winning engine. It is a small block Chevy. Now, for those who are like, the low speed torque because the bigger valve, I'm going to show you this. That was his intake valve size, a 219. 219 intake valve. Okay, and this is on a 406. The valve is huge for that. And then, by the way, you had to be a standard valve angle. You could not use a 18 degree or anything. This is a 23 degree head. And yes, they do measure. Anyway, if it was a 219 valve, and you could tell, look at this torque he has down here. Now, granted, he did a lot of testing. It's 474 at the hit at 2,500. Okay, it ends up making 673 horsepower, 581 torque. This is a beast. By the way, you had to use chassis headers at that time too. So, beast. Now, here's the kicker, because I'm watching him just destroy us. Because guess what? Watch this. That's second place. And this is School of Automotive Machinists, and this was the Cleveland. Look at its valve size, 215. And then here's John Causey, the man. Him and Bischoff battled several times, but I think Bischoff got the bit out of him most times. But his intake valve's 225. Look at the bore size, 4 inch. I could promise you he wasn't caring about coefficient of discharge. Promise. Because he could have got a smaller valve diameter in there and had a higher coefficient discharge. And he did really good. If you look at the scores, this is a 2429.5. The winning one, 2461.1. So they're not that, I mean, it sounds like it's a lot, but just something to think about. Anyway, whenever they did a full article on this, which I have somewhere and I just couldn't find it handy, he said this head only flowed 344. If you do the math, and the coefficient of discharge for that, I promise you, it sucked compared to, look at this one. This is another small block Chevy done by Sam, so Sam's also good. This one had, my GoPro died because it got overheated, so first time using that, lesson learned. But anyway, what I was trying to get at is, I promise you that if you look at the small block Chevy from Sam, I promise you that with this 125 valve that they had, and this was an all-pro head, I promise you it had a higher coefficient of discharge because it probably flowed 340 as well. 344 or so, the same as what Bischoff's did, but with a larger valve. I promise you, he had a worse coefficient of discharge, but it was better. So it's not the end-all be-all is what I'm trying to get at. It's important, but it's not the most important thing. So anyway, I hope that kind of helps you with the larger valves. It probably gives you more information to think about, more questions as well. But hopefully that helps you guys and you can have a better understanding about that as well. Anyway, thanks for watching and sticking around. Hopefully I can get these two edited together and it goes well. But you guys take care and enjoy the rest of your day.